to introduce our speaker today, who is one of our very own. Dr. Mathew Abrams is the Assistant Director in the Tata Cornell Institute, TCI, for Agriculture and Nutrition, an institution that focuses on addressing issues of poverty, malnutrition, and sustainable agricultural development in India and other developing countries. They are located on the third floor directly above us, so please be sure to check them out if you have more questions about the Institute. At TCI, Mathew coordinates research activities and offers strategic guidance and support for project implementation. Mathew has a background in agricultural economics and international development. His work involves collaborating with a wide range of stakeholders, including academic research institutions, government agencies, NGOs, local communities, to implement evidence-based solutions that drive economic growth and improve nutritional outcomes. Dr. Mathew Abraham has a PhD from the Department of International Economics and Management, Copenhagen Business School in Denmark. He's going to be sharing with us today some evidence from India on the effects of market proximity on the profitability of farmer collectives. With that, let's give a round of applause to Dr. Mathew Abrams.
All right, can you hear me? Okay, lovely. Thank you all. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for this opportunity to present some of our work to you. So I'll just get right to it. So in today's lecture, what I'm going to talk about is I'm going to talk about the effects of geographical location on profitability of farmer collectives, and I'm going to look very specifically on India. So this particular project is part of a larger research initiative that TCI has been undertaking since 2019. And so this research endeavor basically looks at aggregation models both in India and Latin America to identify opportunities, constraints, and also shed light on a particular area that has been largely understudied. It's been in existence for a long time, aggregation models, but it's been understudied. So the results of much of our research and work under the project has led to the creation of a lot of data resources and knowledge resources, and you will find all these data and knowledge resources on our website. And during the course of this talk, I will be referring to some of these, and feel free to visit our website, and most of them are free, and so you can have a look at it. So before you do any of that, I think I should tell you what aggregation models really are. So aggregation models are, I'm sorry. Yep. Oh, good. All right. So aggregation models are basically, institutional arrangements by which small and marginal farmers get together, form these groups, and rectify some of these disadvantages that they have to access markets and become more sustainable, improve their incomes, etc. So what we've seen in the last 20 to 30 years is this resurgence of this interest in promoting farmer organizations and aggregation models in India. FPOs, the organizations that I'm looking at in this lecture are forms of aggregation models. And so there is, not just in India, but across the developing world, there is this resurgence of interest in looking at aggregation models. And fundamentally, the relevance of aggregation models emerge from the fact that about 84% of all farms across the globe are less than 2 hectares in size. And this small farm sectors often house the most economically disadvantaged, and food insecure populations. And bringing development to the small farm sectors would actually help in economic development and reduction of many of these challenges. So the problem is that many of these small farms face significant disadvantages in accessing markets and commercializing. When I say accessing markets, small farms have trouble accessing factor markets from which they would access credit, high quality inputs such as seeds and fertilizers. Using these inputs, be able to increase surpluses at farm levels, and then sell the surpluses at the market. And unless you have surpluses, marketable surpluses, incomes don't increase. And many of these small farms are constrained by their size because you have limited economies of scale. Because of their size, there's also poor market linkages, especially to financial markets to get credit. They also have low bargaining power when it comes to selling produce in the market, fundamentally because, again, of the volume of produce, etc. So it's generally accepted that promotion of aggregation models will help in small farm sustainability, improve incomes, etc. So we talk a lot about, resurgence and re-emergence of aggregation models, fundamentally because aggregation models are not new. So we've seen aggregation models in existence since the 19th and 20th century. And developing countries like India, aggregation models first emerged in the early 1900s. It was set up by the colonial governments, and fundamentally not out of any benevolence, but largely because land revenues was the major source of income, largest revenue source to the government. And you have various famines occurring at various points in time. And after each famine, there used to be these, what you call famine commissions, which were set up in order to try and understand why these happen. So there was the first famine commission was set up in 1880, and they realized that, yes, indebtedness in rural areas was a big problem, and this needed to be addressed. Following the famine of 1901, in 1904, the first cooperatives were actually established. So you see these cooperatives being established early on in the 20th century. But what we also see is that these, cooperative models were, replicas of, the European models like Rasmussen credit models, which were put in India. And you had the emergence of producer cooperatives also emerging at much later stages, but they never saw the same level of success as the European models did. And many of these countries, you had cooperatives failing fundamentally because there was a lot of mistrust. It was very top-down. There was elite capture and state capture of these. There was low participation of members in these cooperatives. And as a result of this, these cooperatives really did not take off. In countries with socialist paths and that model a lot of the development around socialist ideals, we see this, initiatives of collectivization. So case in point, China, Vietnam, countries like Ethiopia, Tanzania, where you have the JAMA system. What you have is you have collective farms and collectivization happening. But what we also see is by the late 70s and 80s, many of these collective units, countries start to decollectivize. So giving more, agency to the producer over their produce. And towards the late 80s and the 90s, what you also see is a re-emergence of aggregation happening again, because farms are small. You needed, to empower farmers, and aggregation models are seen again as a way to enable this. So what you have is, aggregation models existing, a lull, and then you see this reemergence. And we're going through this period of reemergence as we speak, and different donor agencies promoting it in really large ways. But what we also see is in this reemergence is the fact that there is not just one model of aggregation that is happening. You had the cooperative movements globally that was relevant, but what you see is different models of aggregation happening. So in 2022, we did this review of literature on the evidence around aggregation models and how it influences livelihoods and betters income at farm level. And what we found is that in many countries, cooperatives are still a dominant form of aggregation, but there are other forms of aggregation that are coming up. In farmer producer organizations are one, different other enterprises, agribusiness enterprises. And then there is also reforms within existing aggregation models like ejidos in Mexico, and this getting a shot in the arm in order to, again, as an instrument to improve rural livelihoods. So this, the review, which we did, also found really interesting components. We also found that a majority of these aggregation models that were created did not focus on, staples, but it focused largely on higher value agricultural produce. So if you look at in various countries, you'd see fruits and vegetables being a major crop that aggregation models engaged in, cash crops, dairy, livestock, etc., which are higher value agricultural produce. And this is largely also influenced by the fact that the changes in food system as preferences for diets change, incomes increase, the demand for higher value agricultural produce also increase. And so what you also see in different countries, aggregation models are either focused on local markets, by which they produce for internal markets, and especially this is true for China, India, and other countries. And there are other countries, such as in Latin America, where aggregation models are more focused towards export markets. And this is largely in cash crops, such as coffee, etc. So these models become really relevant as we see going forward. So in India, too, you see this huge focus, especially in the past 20, 23 years, on aggregation models coming up. The cooperative experience in India is that, especially with producer cooperatives, other than milk and sugar, many of the cooperatives in India largely failed. And so in the early 2000s, the government said that, yes, we need to rethink this whole aggregation model aspect of it. And so they brought in this new form called the Farmer Producer Companies. It was an amendment that was done to a Companies Act that allowed for cooperatives to be formed, but they were more like a hybrid between a cooperative and a company. And so, and the government has been trying to promote this in a very large way. And since 2003, the provisions to form farmer producer companies were put into place. But what we see is from 2015, there's a surge in the promotion of farmer producer organizations in India. And this is also fundamentally due to a perverse incentive that came about, saying that they were looking at a numbers game. They wanted to promote as many farmer producer organizations. And so you started funding NGOs to promote farmer producer organizations in India in a large way. And as a result of NGOs getting a sum of money, it became a revenue model for them. So what you see is quite interesting that, there's a sudden jump of FPO promotion in 2016, and by 21, 24, you see within that short period, there were over 30,000 FPOs that are promoted. So currently in India, there are about 45,000 FPOs that are in existence. We just got the data yesterday, and this is the latest number. But if you look at them, how many of them are sustainable and functioning, it's probably a quarter of them are really functioning. Many of them are formed. They don't last very long. In about 3 years, they collapse and fail. So what you also have is the government promoting FPOs in a large way. A lot of donor organizations stepping into the space and promoting FPOs in a large way. And the impacts of FPOs and how many of them, emerge to become sustainable is always a question. And so that's always an issue that's going to be hanging, over this whole policy. But promoting effective FPOs that are sustainable is really important. But another way to think of this is that if you look at the startup space and entrepreneurship literature, what you also see is that but 80% of startups often get either fail or get bought up, and it's only just about 20% that actually succeed. So when you're looking at farmers who some of them barely literate, resource constraint, there's not enough information and support. Expecting them to succeed is still a large leap, but it's still really important for this to happen. So now the whole question of why is geography important for farmer producer organizations is a really important question. This is largely the background and becoming, narrowing down to the question that we are asking. So the literature on smallholder producers and producer organization, the role of geography and, performance is really understudied. But what the literature is quite rife with examples of the effects of geography on individual small farms. what we see is that farms that are located further from market often face higher transaction costs. They have problems accessing markets. So, and many of the services are filled in by intermediaries because access to markets are not possible. You also have high coordination costs in your ability to access these markets. So we do know from literature that if you're looking at small farms and small farm access to markets, it is problematic. But there is also this new wave of literature that's come out in the last 20 years that looks at vertical coordination mechanisms by which, because of changing demand, because of changing consumption patterns and demand for higher value agricultural crops, you do see buyers going down to farm levels, forming contracts, forming these alternative arrangements to buy directly from farmers. And this is what you call vertical coordination. In the vertical coordination literature, also, you see this effect that, buyers would often prefer, aggregation models that are located in high potential areas. Farms that are better connected to markets, or localities that grow crops of a specific variety in larger numbers. Many of the vertical coordination initiatives prefer larger farmers than smaller farms, fundamentally because there are many of these coordination costs, because you have to align a lot of producers in order to meet their particular demand. So it's generally preferred not to look at small farms and farms that are more further away from it. So then what you see is that vertical coordination is largely constrained as a result of these geographical indicators. And so now the question largely is that if, in theory, aggregation models should allow small farms to rectify some of these disadvantages of accessing markets and commercializing, what role does the location of aggregation models play in the profitability of farmer producer organizations in India? So this becomes a central question that we ask with this research, because rectifying disadvantages of location, if it helps improve profitability, it is a major policy indicator of something that needs to be done. Is this relationship between geography and profitability a straightforward one? You could potentially have a positive relationship. If you have farmer producer organizations that are closer to markets, you'll have reduced transportation costs, handling costs. You might have reduced information asymmetries. At the same time, if you're closer to urban hubs, you are in more competitive environments by which you will have a larger number of buyers coming in and buying your particular produce. And of course, there is also the issue of access to capital, to credit, to inputs and services, which becomes easier if you're closer to larger urban areas. But there could potentially also be a negative relationship. So areas that are closer to urban centers could see greater labor mobility because of higher opportunities in urban areas. You can see this influx of people moving out of the agricultural sector into the urban areas, which could potentially reduce labor availability or increase costs of labor. That's one aspect. The other one is, organizations near marketplaces could also be affected by oversupply, fundamentally because of large amount of influx of produce coming in from various locations. But more importantly, you may also see an incentive problems for farmer producer organizations for farms closer to urban areas, fundamentally because you don't have that high transaction costs. Markets are easily accessible. You don't have constraints in accessing, inputs. So your incentives to form farmer producer organizations may also differ. So being mindful of both a positive relationship and a negative relationship with these components is also really important. And so this also makes the research question a little more relevant in order to see what influences, whether there are negative or positive influences of proximity. So this is the data that we use. So when we started this initiative in 2019, what we realized was there is absolutely no data on farmer producer organizations in India. So we got a grant to start this particular project, and then the pandemic hit and everything shut down. And so we had to re-look at the way we're going to design this particular project and how to do it. So first things first, this started off as an intellectual endeavor, just to see, we want to know how many farmer producer organizations exist in India. And there was no number. There is no national organization that collects this number, fundamentally because farmer producer organizations are promoted by various entities, the government, state government, aid organizations, etc. So we didn't have a number. So what we tried to do was, if you're a farmer producer company, you're registered under the Companies Act. And so we went to the Ministry of Corporate Affairs, where each of these companies are actually registered, and took tried to sieve out farmer producer organizations in this. And this is an endeavor we do, periodically, fundamentally, because there's no classification of whether it's a company or a farmer producer company. So you'll get the whole dump of it. Then you have to sit and, try and tease out the number of farmer producer organizations in it. It's a big endeavor. So what happened was an intellectual endeavor transformed into a data visualization endeavor, by which we put it up online. And then it turned out into a database, and now it's a public good. And we are also looking at various ways in order to turn this public good into an interactive tool, a discovery platform where buyers and sellers can come discover each other, form contracts, and link with each other. So that's the transformation of this particular data dashboard. We are going through a major overhaul of this particular data dashboard right now. By the end of the month, potentially, we will have the new version of it. But feel free to go online and have a look at it. It'll give you a really good visualization of farmer producer organizations in India. So much so that the TCI data dashboard is now the source of information about farmer producer. And the government uses this as a source for saying that, how many farmer producer organizations exist in India. So this, when we formed this particular database, we realized that we do have information on farmer producer organizations at the organizational level, not at the individual level, but at the organization level, by which we can actually look at the profitability, the number of shareholders, the size, the crops that they grow, etc. And so then what we did was we merged, we created another data set by merging various sources to look at geographical indicators. There are 12 different other sources to look at rainfall, infrastructure such as road connectivity, rail connectivity, district level data, which is again from another initiative by TCI, it's called the TCI ICRISAT data district level database. If you want information on agricultural indicators in India from 1950s onwards to 2019, it's freely available on these websites. And so we brought this data set together in order to answer this particular question. And so this is this simple regression model that we're following. We looking at the dependent variable as profits to FPOs, and we are trying to look at how the distance to the nearest township, which again is an proxy for distance to market, is influenced. And also we specified this particular model with FPO characteristics, spatial characteristics, rainfall, both district and agroecological level, fixed effects. But again, the problem here is that we run into an identification problem. We have this problem of endogeneity, by which we see that the variable location of markets can be correlated with the error term, fundamentally because there are a lot of unobserved factors that we're not accounting for, which may influence the location of markets in a particular area, and primarily political favorism, economic potential, poor targeting, which can often lead to the formation of markets in different places. We also have this problem of simultaneity or reverse causation, fundamentally because you may have FPOs that have the potential to be more profitable emerging in locations closer to markets, fundamentally because of its an advantage. So the causation may be reversed. And so as a result of it, there are two issues that come up with the specification. One is that the error term in the equation is likely to be correlated to distance to market. And the second problem is there is a violation of assumption of exogeneity. And in order to address this problem, we use an instrumental variable approach. And so an instrumental variable that we use in this particular analysis is the number of years since the nearest railway segment was built near an FPO. So this can be used as a proxy to distance to markets. And fundamentally, it's because of this, because if you look at transportation infrastructure and development of railroads in particular, we see there is enough evidence to show that it has led to urbanization, population growth, and also enhanced market access to markets. We also see that, and we use railway constructions from the period 1853 to 1931. Fundamentally, this is a period in which the connectivity factors were put in place, and it does not influence, it is very likely to influence the factors leading to the decision of forming FPOs. And so what we see is that under the colonial period, we see that railway lines were largely constructed in order to connect major markets to ports. So the first markets that were connected were the major markets, and subsequently the minor markets were connected by railroads. The railroad construction in colonial India was so extensive. So from 1853 to 1947, over 54,000 kilometers of rail lines were put in place. On an average, it was about 600 kilometers a year. And since 1947 to about 2018, you see the expansion being 10,000 kilometers. So you have, during that period, only 10,000 kilometers were built. On an average, about 120 kilometers a year. But again, much of the investments have been in upgrading these infrastructures, converting narrow gauges to broad gauges, electrification, etc. So the year in which the railway segment was formed becomes a good proxy, and we use that as an instrument in order to address for endogeneity. So what are some of the empirical findings of this? So first, let me just go through some of the descriptive statistics. What we see is, if you look at the distribution of FPOs in India, you see that the densest prevalence of FPOs are in central and southern part of India, whereas northern states such as Madhya Pradesh and Uttar Pradesh have larger number of FPOs. It's fundamentally because of these are larger states. But if you look at density of FPOs, you'd see much in central India and southern part of India. So Maharashtra, of course, has the largest. So Maharashtra would be, so this state over here. It's also one of the more agriculturally developed states. So you have the largest number of FPOs in Maharashtra, as you'd expect. So we use data from 2017 to 2019, and fundamentally, despite the fact that you have a large number of FPOs, what we try to do is we try to see FPOs that are active and compliant, by compliance, I mean FPOs that are, functioning as companies. They submit their financials to the revenue services. And this is an indicator of whether the company is functioning or not. So what we find is that we have about 2,325 FPOs in 2019 that are active and compliant, which fundamentally means that they are functioning, despite the fact that in 2019, there were about 12,000 FPOs that were in existence. Still about a fair number. That an average number of the FPOs that we're looking at is about 4 years. And then we have small FPOs that have about 10 shareholders, and we've got large FPOs that are about 1,600 members. So this is a huge range of aggregation models that we're looking at. So we also see that the average distance from an FPO to a closest city is about 30 kilometers. on an average, one district in the with the data that we look at has about 12 FPOs. And 68% of the land of FPOs are used in agriculture, and about a majority of farmers participating in these districts are small and marginal farmers. So what we also see is a majority of the land in many of the districts where these FPOs are involved in non-cereal cultivation. So you're looking at higher value agricultural produce, not just wheat and rice or low value agricultural produce. So this is the major finding of this study. The major finding of this study is the fact that the relationship between market proximity and markets is that we see with an increase in distance from the market, the FPO profitability actually decreases. So what we see is with each kilometer increase in a distance between a township of 5,000 to 10,000 inhabitants, which is what you call as a class 5 town, we see the profitability per shareholder decreasing by 890 rupees. So this is a major finding, and if you convert it to US dollars PPP equivalent, it's about $44. So you also have other factors. The study also finds other factors that actually influence profitability. We see that the larger the FPO, the larger the profit. So clearly the economies of scale argument comes in quite in effect here. The larger number of farmers that you have, the larger returns that you will get. You also see a non-linear relationship between cropland, the percentage of a particular crop grown in a particular region. And this is also in line with the literature which talks about if a particular crop is grown extensively in one particular district, it becomes more attractive for buyers to go and engage in these particular locations. So we also see that if there are agro industries located in these districts, and if the railway density in these districts are high, what you see is the profitability also seems to be positive. And also FPOs that are located in districts that have more diversified cropping systems tend to be more profitable. This is also in line with the finding that FPOs and aggregation models makes more sense in smallholder systems that are engaged in the production of more higher value crops, where market failures are higher for smallholder producers. By rectifying some of this, they can actually improve profitability at market levels. So what are the larger implications of this study? So first is the issue of geography and location having an influence on profitability is of great, policy relevance to policymakers and also to FPOs and FPO promoting organizations. Fundamentally, that we need to rectify some of this. One would be investment in, infrastructure that reduces the hindrance in connectivity to markets, but also, designing FPOs in ways by which some of these disadvantages can be rectified. So if you have joint selling activities or joint procurement of certain kind of inputs, how can these organizations be designed in such a way that these particular resources can be mobilized more closely and more easily? If markets are much more further from farms, potential of vertical integration becomes high. Farmer producer organizations can relieve some of the concerns of vertical coordination initiatives in order to enable better connections. These are really important aspects that potentially come out of this. So the second aspect of this is we've done this big study on trying to find, collate all the evidence around farmer producer organizations in India. And what we see is that a majority of studies focuses at returns to farm level. So it's income increases, productivity increases. Many of these, empirical studies have relied on surveys of farm level households. And it looks largely at returns to individuals. But there is a sheer dearth of studies that look at organizational level capabilities of FPOs. And fundamentally, because there is no data available, you can't look at an FPO at an organizational level. And it's hard to design surveys that look at 40,000 farmer producer organizations in India. So this study, using this particular database that collates this particular information, is really relevant. And so this is one major contribution that this particular study has done. So, and this also kind of points to the need for data ecosystems to emerge, and and need for government-based organizations and governments to keep relevant information such as this. This is very basic information. You're promoting 45,000 FPOs in a country, out of which in the past 5 years you've promoted 11,000 FPOs, and a lot of money is going into it. But you're not collecting basic data about how many FPOs exist, how many of them are sustainable, how many of them are functioning. That becomes a huge problem. So, having research in line with this, and also having sources that allow you to do such research, becomes really important. So these were largely, some of the studies that we did. So again, like I said, many of these resources that I've spoken to you about are available online. You can go look at the data dashboard, get a picture of what's happening in India. You can download the data. Many of the knowledge resources are also there. A number of blogs, papers, research that our institute does, and many of my colleagues are involved with. These are all available to you. And please, if you're interested in this, come up, chat, use the resources that are available. Good. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have about 10 minutes for Q&A and discussion. If you can quickly introduce yourself and make your question as short as possible so we can integrate as many questions as possible. And for those who are listening online, if you want to type in your question in the comments, then we'll read it out and we'll try to get to those as well. Yes.
Laurie Leonard, professor in global development. Thank you. That was an excellent talk. I'm really interested in FPOs as a category, and I'm wondering if you have the capacity to sort of break that down, because I'm thinking about, my own comparison point is Chad, where a lot of private companies are, especially around cotton production, producing or pushing for FPOs, but as a risk mitigation measure for themselves, right? So they can, if anyone fails to pay them back, or anyone fails to, produce cotton, the risk is spread to the other people in the organization. That's a really different type of FPO than a sort of bottom-up, collective FPO. And I just wonder if disaggregating that category, you may have just said that it's difficult to do, but could lead to a different picture.
Right. So in the literature that we look at, what we see is this category of aggregation model is really wide, and you're right in saying that. So there are two forms that exist. One is the formal models and informal models. And then you have the semi-formal models. So like, say, for example, joint liability groups, such as what you're talking about, where you disperse the liability among all its members, can exist as semi-formals or also informal groups sometimes. Like, say, for example, the self-help group movement in India. It's fundamentally based on that principle, but in micro lending, not in large lending as you would do for cotton farmers. And that is still an informal entity. And we don't know what the number of SHGs in India either, or in many other countries, fundamentally because of this formality aspect of it, whether it's formal, semi-formal, or informal. So the reason we are able to count FPOs in India is because they are formal institutions, and you have to register it with the Ministry of Corporate Affairs. And that was the only reason that we've been able to do it. So much so that we don't know how many cooperatives exist in India either. So there is no cumulative number to it. Fundamentally because cooperatives are registered at various state levels, registered at the national level, etc. And there is no organization that actually brings it all together. Then you also have other forms of aggregation in India, just like you're mentioning in Chad. They are called joint liability groups, again, farmer groups that can jointly access credit from these particular. They are also informal. Only banks recognize them as entities. And because of that informality aspect of it, it becomes extremely difficult to count. And so that's one reason that we put this database together, is that we can count the formal ones, and that's largely it.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your presentation. And I'm really interested with this kind of to know the farmers producer organizations, because I think I'm from Bangladesh, near to India, and also I'm from a place that is full of hills areas. It's near to northeastern India. It's called Chittagong Hill Tracts. So I think this FPOs is quite effective and quite needed for those kind of areas, I think. So so as you saw, you have shown that these organizations are effective, I mean, are common in central and northern India, but not in the northeastern or some kind of the landscape, which are hilly landscapes. So is there any, my question is there any government initiative or any evidences that government is helping to form this kind of groups in those kind of areas? Thank you.
So, okay. Yeah, so there's a data problem there as well. This is data from 2019. If you look at the latest data that's there, you see a large number of FPOs being promoted in the Northeast as well, and in the states of Sikkim and Nagaland, Mizoram. Many of them are cash crop based. It's not, staple grains or anything of that sort. A lot of livestock-based farmer producer organizations also emerging in the Northeast quite effectively. But you've pointed to a really interesting question. So now when you're looking at aggregation or collective action in general, when you're talking about marginal communities, communities that are not linked to mainstream markets, etc., they've always had a history of collective action, especially in the management of common pool resources, forest resources, etc., where so you do have these, again, informal groups, communities coming together and forming these groups and rectifying some of these problems that they have. The main reason, again, coming back to this question over here, is the informality, of course, doesn't let you show this in the larger numbers. So many of these communities would have, these collective institutions that they form informally in order to rectify issues. But here's the main difference in it, because, Laurie, you did mention the whole thing of, emerging organically from below and, institutions just being set up. Many of these institutions emerge because the government is giving money to NGOs to set them up and saying that, okay, we're giving you 25 lakh rupees. You set an FPO and support it for 3 years. So that's, again, a tick mark. That's how 45,000 FPOs come in. So the instances of organic collective action coming up, especially in the FPO space, is far and few, But we do see this happening in women's groups quite effectively in India, where self-help groups, the informal organizations of women getting together, having small savings accounts, wanting to scale up operations, and SHGs forming FPOs. You have examples of that, and that we are trying to identify some of these transitions and see how that allows for better and more stable FPOs to emerge. But that's a really important question. So, despite the fact that, you have informal organizations, you have very strong and stable organizations fundamentally because they're bottom-up organizations. You may have organizations that are set up with a lot of money, with a lot of farmers coming together, but they may not be as stable fundamentally because they lack the social capital that you're talking about. Yeah. Ruchira.
Hi, I'm Ruchira. I'm from Göttingen. Thanks, Matthew. That was a really nice presentation. I just have a quick question. In your results, you just mentioned that the economy of scale. So I just wanted to ask, in your regression results, do you see an association between the profitability of FPOs and the size of the FPOs? I'm asking this because one of the studies that we were doing at IFPRI, and then what we see is, which you also mentioned in the beginning, was which you mentioned again, that if the sizes of the FPOs sort of increase, there are these organizational problems. So, so do you also see that in your results? And the FPOs that you had in your data, what was the number of years that these FPOs sort of existed for? Because as you mentioned that these FPOs kind of started, and especially the ones that were promoted, did not make it for more than 3 years. So I just wanted to ask.
I think to go back to the results, I'm sorry, but so it's there. So one of the major findings that we see is FPOs with larger number of shareholders have higher profitability. So that's one particular component that we can actually see. But the second question that you asked about, collective action problems within groups and the whole question of optimal size, I'm thinking you're referring to that particular component. That's a really important question, which we cannot answer with this particular data. So, so looking at, social capital, how these groups are organized, how they govern themselves internally, how do they address conflicts that emerge? Those are really, really important questions, but unfortunately, we don't have data that's, that's strong in order to answer those components and answer managerial question initiative. But in the literature, if you look at it, especially in collective action literature on common pool resources, what you see is that there is an optimal size component in it. When groups are small, it's much easier to monitor, and you can actually identify collective action problems. When groups become large, there is often a monitoring cost that goes to it because you may not be able to identify. So this whole question of optimal size is a really important question, but we can't answer it quite yet on that.
Angelina, are there any questions online? Not yet? Okay.
Hello, my name is Lee, and thank you so much for your talk. So I just had a question about how does the geographical proximity of the FPOs to the agricultural markets, how does that impact their financial sustainability? And more specifically, I'm interested in if there are any policies that were set by the government that support that.
So yes. So what this data shows is that there is an effect. So the further the farmer producer organization is from the market, there is a profit penalty in the sense that your returns goes down by a certain amount. But what we can't see from this data is what are the main causes for it. But these are really important questions. And so one thing that this research actually puts out is to identify these particular issues, but going more granularly to identify what these aspects are, that would require a lot more research. But that again comes to the question of policy that you were asking. So fundamentally, if you believe that there is an issue of proximity placed on profitability, one of the recommendations that study actually does is to say that how can some of these be rectified. So one potential aspect from the literature that we see is that connectivity is a huge problem. So connectivity can influence profitability in one sense. Transaction costs is another. So how can transaction costs be fundamentally reduced in order to allow for farmer producer organizations to link to markets better? So these are largely the policy implications of it. But the nature of the transaction costs, what are the other limitations in linkages, that really needs to be teased out a lot more. And those are very relevant questions. Yeah.
Okay. Is distance here also correlated with the transaction costs? There's some that are remote, and can you? Well, then we'll get the last question.
No, go ahead, Ed.
Okay, there's one more there.
So is distance correlated with transaction costs? So we don't compute transaction costs in this particular thing, so we can't see the direct relationship, but we can theorize that one of the factors that influences the changes in profitability is transaction costs.
Last question.
Yeah, good afternoon. Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm Mariko from Mali in West Africa. So we are not used to those FPOs. So we work with producers group, but we organize them into cooperative. So I would like to know what make the government of India to prefer this type of producer group than the cooperative. Is there giving them, is there any difference like the number of the members or about the production side or about some subsidy, some crops the government wants them to promote, like a promotion of some value chain than others? Or what is the reason? Thank you.
Thank you. Great question. So that was also one of the premises of this study as well. So cooperatives have been in existence, like I said, since 1901, and even after India's independence in 1947, the government continued to promote cooperatives with the expectation that farmers will get together, aggregate, and and become more sustainable. But in the 1990s, it became really clear that the cooperatives really aren't working, barring milk and sugar cooperatives. And fundamentally, both milk and sugar cooperatives, the reason research attributes their success is the fact that they're both perishable commodities, and there is a need to get it to the factory or processing unit within a stipulated amount of time, which reduces hold-up costs, etc. So the nature of the produce really influenced the way in which these cooperatives function, how people participated in these cooperatives. Another thing for the success of milk and sugar cooperatives in India was they were integrated value chains. So the cooperatives actually owned the milk supply chains, they owned the processing factories. So it was all internalized. So the institutional costs around it was all internalized. But this was an anomaly in general. And you see the example of milk cooperatives being successful globally in many situations. And there are situations where milk cooperatives have failed too, and in the Indian scenario as well. But cooperatives also faced another set of problems. There was, because it was, again, a top-down kind of approach, it relied heavily on the government. It relied heavily on certain political elites for it to sustain. Then productivity at farm levels were not high enough for surpluses to be relevant to be marketed. So participation of members in cooperatives also came down. But I think a major influence that allowed for this shift was also the change in markets. You see, since 1990s, incomes increasing, food systems globalizing, change in demand. So again, because there was a demand side change, there was a need to improve supply, especially of higher value agricultural products. And then you see that these traditional cooperatives are not in a position in order to do that, fundamentally because of all these governance-based issues. And that's why the new form of producer cooperatives came about. And the difference is that although it's based on the principle of cooperation, it fundamentally hinges on being a hybrid between a company and a cooperative with more accountability, etc. So the hope is that this model will succeed, but still.
I think we've run out of time. Please help me thank Dr. Mathew Abraham.
Thank you. Thank you very much.